Welcome to the Treasury Update podcast, presented by Strategic Treasurer, your source for interesting Treasury news, analysis, and insights in your car, at the gym, or wherever you decide to tune in.
Welcome to the Treasury Update podcast. This is Craig Jeffrey, and today's episode is sponsored by TD Bank, and it is on synthetic identities and a CISO view. Today, we have John Doskocil from TD Bank and Tyler Farrar, who's the Chief Information Officer of Exabeam. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Craig. Thrilled to be here.
Great to be here, Craig.
Yeah, before we get started on this topic of synthetic identities, maybe each of you could give us just a quick background of your responsibilities, your career in terms of how it intersects today's topic. Let me begin with you, John.
Sure. So I work in commercial distribution for Treasury Management Services at TD Bank. And we have the opportunity to both educate and advise companies on best practices for accounts payable, accounts receivable, optimizing working capital, and most notably for this conversation, fraud protection and how to create a strong security posture. That includes education on what's going on in the industry when it comes to cybercrime and payments fraud, and help connecting what financial professionals may be experiencing in their everyday operations with observations on industry trends. I did not take a traditional path to banking. I started my career in the Department of Defense, where I managed and helped secure data networks. And during that time, I became Security Plus certified through CompTIA, and gained some real-world cybersecurity experience. So when I eventually made my way into banking and payments, I brought with me a more informed perspective, and drawing on that experience to help companies combat fraud and educate customers is an area of my role that I really enjoy.
And Tyler, thanks for joining us from Exabeam.
Yeah, thanks, Craig. I'm the CISO here at Exabeam. I focus both on enterprise cybersecurity, so more traditional cybersecurity of corporate IT infrastructure, the laptops that employees work on, and protection of those devices, as well as product security to ensure that the product that we sell to our customers is secure and providing that level of assurance that is comfortable for our customers. Prior to Exabeam, I worked at a clear defense contractor, Maxar Technologies. I ran security operations, infrastructure governance, cyber assurance, and USG, U.S. government program protection functions. Prior to that, consulted with KPMG, and I worked on various engagements like FedRAMP, next-gen security operations, vulnerability management. And before that, just like John, was a naval officer. I worked in the cryptologic warfare community, heavily was focused on cybersecurity operations and various multi-million-dollar projects within U.S. Cyber Command.
I'm going to begin asking you, John, a few questions about the bank's view of synthetic identities and how customers should be thinking about that.
Synthetic identity fraud really has become a leading area of concern for all industries, particularly industries that interact with consumers, where, a criminal can get some sort of financial gain through creating a false identity. In general, synthetic identity fraud has been around forever, and it's evolved over time in kind of a spy versus spy way, where criminals will exploit a vulnerability and the industry will respond in defending it. And then criminals will find another creative way to commit these crimes. I guess as the old adage goes, necessity is the mother of innovation. And unfortunately, in this case, it kind of goes both ways. But I'd like to start by maybe giving a background, maybe get to understand it a little bit, synthetic identity, just a little bit better. So if we go back in time where we were mostly doing business in person and in local communities, your personal identity was your appearance or a signature. But as commerce expanded geographically and identity fraud has kind of evolved with it, it's become more necessary to have these layers of identity. So now we have things like your driver's license or your passport. And then in the advent of the internet, almost everything that we do today is done remotely. Or in some cases, we have personal or business relationships with people whom we've never met before physically. How many times have you wrote the email, "It's nice to meet you virtually," or it's nice to meet you via email? And all of this has kind of given rise to an environment where a significant amount of personal information and business information is available publicly through the internet. We want our customers to know as much as possible about who we are and what we're about, but we don't want that to be used against us. So we find ourselves in a position today where we as individuals are more susceptible than ever to having our identity stolen. Financial practitioners in particular are more susceptible than ever to falling victim to being tricked by criminals who create these synthetic identities. We're experiencing significant financial loss, business disruption, and reputational risk when they're able to convince somebody on the finance team that they're a vendor or, as crazy as it might sound, the CFO or even a service provider. So criminals have gained this wide avenue of approach where they can use publicly sourced information or information that they've gained through social engineering to defraud financial practitioners trying to operate in the digital economy. And that means that, we have to be so much better now than ever before in identifying what's going on. And that starts by really understanding what synthetic identity fraud is and how to defend against it.
John, how does a synthetic identity impact things like man-in-the-middle or business email compromise?
Business email compromise factors into this in a way that's really unique. The criminals are able to create an identity that is not one that's their own, right? So it's an identity that's been fabricated through publicly available information and also information maybe that they've gained through monitoring an email box, right? So synthetic identity plays into the ability of a criminal to defraud an employee. And because of that, it's created an environment that's very dangerous for financial practitioners to operate in. And I think that, understanding how synthetic identity plays in is an important way to also defend ourselves from falling victim to it.
Thanks for the details on that, John. Now let's shift over to you, Tyler. How are companies being exploited? I know you have stories, you've got examples. Maybe you could open up how these companies are being exploited, and the CISO and provider view would be very helpful here to build on what John said.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to reiterate and expand upon what John mentioned, you have financial institutions where their main charge is to protect money. But there's also this digital asset and the network that is certainly worthy of that same type of protection. And as John mentioned, you're talking about millions of dollars in costs if a breach does occur. How the financial industry has become a prime target for external threats has been through means such as credential theft and phishing and ransomware attacks. And it definitely has increased with the adoption of new technology like mobile banking and digital-only banks and other kinds of financial management technology. What should we be focused on as an industry? That number one piece here is compromised credentials. It is the major root cause of nearly every single cyber breach that we've seen over these last few years. And it's usually due to an insufficient set of controls that are related to identity. And you have these traditional methods of issuing a user ID and a password, and it's created an environment that's just rich in account takeover and fraud. And if you have compromised credentials, now you're posing that tremendous threat to the cybersecurity of your organization. And in the hands of a malicious actor, you're talking about them getting access to the most sensitive information in your company. The sources of this compromise are often due to man-in-the-middle attacks, business email compromise like phishing scams, where a credentialed user just clicks on something that they're not supposed to, right? A malicious link. But it also could happen as a result of just someone being negligent. And that's what we call a negligent insider. So think about like an employee who just doesn't follow proper IT procedures. Maybe they left their computer without logging out. Maybe you had an IT administrator that forgot to change a default password. Maybe they forgot to apply a security patch, or maybe somebody was walking in the parking lot and they picked up a USB device and it was infected and they plugged it into their computer. And those compromised credentials are really what we call the home base for cyber criminals. It allows them to establish the persistence. It allows them to move laterally. It allows them to scan your file shares, find your data, create new accounts, escalate the privileges, and then siphon out your high value assets or that private data. And so I mentioned a little bit about what is the key risk here. How do they do it? I said phishing. Phishing is a big one. And when we think about fraud and business email compromise and synthetic identities, a big target here is your payroll departments, your accounts payable departments, your accounts receivable departments. Think about getting an email and it says your account is in need of immediate attention. Or think about getting a compelling email from your CEO asking, can you change my banking information? I'm working here now at this bank and I need you to send my paycheck here, right? It is very compelling. It looks very realistic and it's all clickbait. It sounds official. It resembles somebody that's trusted. Maybe again, it's the bank. Maybe it's the CEO. Maybe it's the CFO. Maybe it's a third-party organization that the company does business with that is asking to change banking routing information. It is absolutely leveraged and used to establish a foothold into your organization's network and compromise those credentials. And again, it allows them to move laterally, it allows them to take over accounts, and it allows them to exfiltrate data.
Yeah, Tyler, there's something that you said in there I think that's really important. And in many ways, the synthetic identity isn't the goal, right? Creating the synthetic identity is not the goal. The goal is the financial gain. So the criminals will be as patient as possible. And in some cases, it'll be months or years before they, bust out or they commit the crime. They'll create this false sense of urgency and, they'll use the synthetic identity that they've created or they create this identity or this trust with whoever their target is. And then they'll wait for the right time and then make that, an urgent ask and disappear without a trace.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can think about the end goal here is not creating the synthetic identity. The end goal is usually to capitalize and make money. And so either that could be through, again, exfiltration of data and or sensitive information, or there's another threat here, which is malware, right? It's ransomware and access to a banking network or to the data that a banking network contains is extremely profitable for an attacker. And there's ransomware as a service that's available on the dark web. So no longer do you need somebody who's proficient in writing malicious code. They can absolutely get on the dark web and in a matter of minutes, just initiate a ransomware attack that can pay for itself within days or even hours. While ransomware is certainly similar to other modern malware attempts to avoid detection, it is another means that cyber criminals will use in order to profit.
When we were prepping for today's discussion, we talked about, all of these activities of criminals to create a synthetic identity to get to data, to get to money or cash. I remember one of you shared a story about deep fake videos to apply for remote work. Really, really interesting. It's like you go through all that to apply for work, especially in a remote work environment. As we move off of this, how they're being exploited, how are criminals succeeding at this, from phishing to ransomware to exfiltrating data or getting money out. Let's talk a little bit about defense in depth and what is the strategy for better defense. I know you have 3 steps that you highlight, Tyler. I know we probably don't have time for all 3 of them, but maybe you could talk us through what you see are the key steps, and let's get into some detail on these.
Absolutely. Because of the threats that we just talked about, you've seen CISOs or cybersecurity programs expand and focus on analyzing user behaviors, employing fraud detection programs, developing other advanced verification methods for account recovery, and to eliminate that synthetic identity fraud. What we focus on here and what I would recommend to the listeners today is, number one is to build out your key objectives. It's really important to focus and balance prevention and response, incident response. There's a lot of focus today on prevention of breach. Breaches will happen. And so what you do during incident response and crisis management is equally as important. So what are those key objectives? Number one, I talked about prevention. Reduce your cyber attack surface. Focus on reducing your cyber attack surface. And number two is where you are going to have threats that attempt to breach your network, you need to deploy capabilities for threat detection, investigation, and response. When you think about where should I focus on key objective number one around reducing that cyber attack surface, I would recommend that listeners focus on prioritizing areas of risk, remediating areas of risk that are major root causes of breaches. And there's a book out there that is authored by Neil Daswani, and his book is called Big Breaches, Cybersecurity Lessons for Everyone. Highly recommend the book. There are 6 root causes, and I'll share with you today.
A quick question for Tyler. When you talk about attack surface, that's a very IT or security position. What do you mean by attack surface in this discussion?
When I talk about reducing the cyber attack surface, I'm talking about reducing the likelihood and ability for a cyber threat actor to breach your network or to take advantage of, a specific security vulnerability.
So in our physical office, we have doors as points of access or who we grant in there. On the network side, what would be some examples that we would think of in terms of an attack surface?
Examples here would be your intrusion detection and intrusion prevention systems. Examples would be patching, having a solid patching cadence and patching especially exploitable vulnerabilities. One other example would be good configuration management, meaning that you are taking your laptops that everyone's working on with, endpoints, and ensuring that they're in a configuration that is secure. It is also being patched, etc.
So is email, is that a surface area of attack that has both IT and the user involved? Is that not a surface area of attack because it's after it comes through the filters?
When we talk about email threat protection and email as a vector, and email being one of the larger vectors of cyber threat actors that they utilize, email threat protection is absolutely a tool that can be utilized to reduce that cyber attack surface. So it is automatically sitting in front of your email flow into your company and filtering out the known bads, thus drastically reducing the amount of potential malicious emails that could come into one of your employees' mailboxes. Another tool that you can leverage to reduce the cyber attack surface with respect to email is around reducing the ability to spoof an email, to look like the CEO, to look like the CFO. That's called DMARC, and it's another big tool leveraged by cybersecurity professionals in order to reduce or to eliminate business email compromise.
Does it make sense to talk about how that works at a macro level? This is, I know some of the people in the audience are very, very IT or CISO savvy. Others are treasury or finance professionals. Maybe I'll ask a question where you can tell me if this makes sense. I know in terms of emails, that's all governed by your domain name server, where the rights are. It says where this information can come from. It's like Rosetta Stone of what comes out, and there's settings you can use to define what systems it can come from. So if someone just says, I'm going to send an email, and it says it comes from Acme Corporation, but it's not, there's some things that will get captured or tracked. Is that what we're talking about here? And then there's other services that ensure nobody sends data out from your domain?
Yes, implementation of business email compromise is intended to only allow verified senders to send from your email domain on your behalf. So that could be internally, right? And we only allow emails to come from internal sources, approved internal sources, or it could be an external source. Maybe it's a marketing vendor that you leverage as a third-party partner, and it's working alongside that partner to implement this DMARC policy in order to specifically allow this trusted partner to send emails on behalf of your company's domain.
Excellent. Anything else on attack surfaces or capabilities that provide defenses in this first area?
I would highly recommend that everybody listening to this today understands and pushes to understand the business complexity within your organization. It's really important for IT professionals and security professionals. If security teams do not understand network infrastructure, various systems or applications that are deployed and how they all work and talk to each other. And where I'm getting at with this is an asset inventory. It will become very difficult, if not impossible, to effectively prevent and respond to a security incident or security breach. So if your company is continuing to add business complexity, I would caution that you may be doing things wrong.
So that covers the first step, the reduce the attack surface. You also mentioned detect and block attacks.
From a threat detection, investigation, response, a lot of the goals here are to deploy various technologies that can help block and detect what really are very highly motivated adversaries, particularly within the banking sector. And so some things that I would recommend and think about are endpoint detection and response, blocking and protecting your laptop from a malware incident. I already mentioned around email threat protection. There is a detective component to that. And a big one around identity. We talked about compromised credentials being the key root cause of breaches, is utilizing behavioral analytics and automation and having more purpose-built content that allows a security analyst to really see across detection of a threat all the way to incident response and being able to quickly detect any kind of anomalous behavior. And then ensuring that those technologies are monitoring all activity on your network, maybe your Swift transactions and all of your cloud instances.
Excellent. And then the third area, which was cyber assurance. I don't know if you had any quick thoughts on that. I know we only thought we might get to 2. Is there anything that you would like to at least point us in the direction of on cyber assurance?
When we talk about cyber assurance, we're talking about providing a level of assurance to our customers that we're doing things right, we're following best practices around security, and that is not specific or applicable to any one company in any one industry. That's applicable to all of us. And how we provide that level of assurance through obviously various compliance and certification frameworks, but also through the prior 2 objectives that I just spoke about, and being able to tell that story and show that improvement around how a company has reduced that cyber attack surface, about how we have capabilities to detect a threat or block a threat. And it is telling that story aligned with, like I mentioned, compliance certifications and in audits to really pull the full picture together to provide that cyber assurance to customers that we are, reducing the potential for either third-party risk or, breach of a customer data.
As we bring this podcast to a close, I wanted to bring you back in, John, particularly about closing advice. How should we think? How should we act? What should we be sharing with others in our organization to understand synthetic identities, how companies are being exploited, how we can help with the defense of our organizations, because everyone has some element of being involved in the defense of our organization.
Yeah, thanks, Craig. Well, I'm so encouraged by, the answers, how in depth they are by Tyler, because I think that it really highlights all of the different stakeholders that a company needs to be engaging to create a good cyber defense posture and defend against payments fraud. It's kind of like a symptom versus a disease, right? So when we try to treat the symptom of the payments fraud, but we don't understand the disease, which may be the synthetic identity or the malware or the uses or the tactics that criminals use to exploit our operations, I think that we miss the mark, right? So when we think about understanding a good and developing a good cybersecurity posture for ourselves and making ourselves and others in the digital economy safe, we have to be looking at all of the different stakeholders that are involved. So, having Tyler's perspective, I learned so much just by listening to this and being on this podcast, because there's such a depth of knowledge that we need to be making ourselves aware of. And we can only do that by having good partnerships. So who's in your foxhole with you? Who are the stakeholders that you have aligned with? Are they providing education? Are they providing, the ability for you and your company to create a safe environment for work? And I think that that's incredibly important. And that would, I think, be the main piece of advice that I would give is to take a look at and understand cybersecurity and defending your company in a more broad perspective. It's just not the bank that's going to take care of you. It's just not one cybersecurity company that's going to take care of you. It's a holistic group of stakeholders that you can partner with. And in doing that, you can create a stronger cybersecurity posture overall and defend against the symptoms of payment fraud.
You've reached the end of another episode of the Treasury Update podcast. Be sure to follow Strategic Treasurer on LinkedIn. Just search for Strategic Treasurer. This podcast is provided for informational purposes only, and statements made by Strategic Treasurer LLC on this podcast are not intended as legal, business, consulting, or tax advice. For more information, visit and bookmark strategictreasurer.com.